Dobry wieczór. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak in English. I learned Russian long ago. I forget almost everything. I'm going to talk to you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm impressed by the people who have spoken in this room. I've just been told, I'm going to talk to you about the euro area crisis. But I'm mostly interested in discussing with you, so hearing your reactions, your questions, and therefore I'm going to have a talk of about 40-45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a lively debate. The events that we have seen unfolding over the last 3 years started, as you know, in a very small corner of Europe and gradually developed into a major crisis with even global repercussions. And again, last week in Tokyo, at the meetings of the IMF, the focus was on the euro crisis, as it has been for the last few meetings in the IMF or the G20, always coming back to this euro crisis and the global repercussions. So it's a major event, but it's also an interesting event, this crisis. It's an interesting event because it tells us lessons about what it implies to create a currency. Normally, a currency goes with a country, and sometimes countries dissolve, and the currency also largely follows the nation state, and this is largely what happens here in this country. But here, there was a project of creating a currency without a state. That was a major utopia. That was a major endeavor. And in the process of having this crisis, we're learning what exactly a currency implies. One of the people in charge of managing this crisis once said, it's about like having a car, being on the road. You normally drive your car, the car works, and suddenly the car stops working. And then you have to open the hook and look and see what doesn't work. And you discover that it's something that doesn't work that you barely knew existed. And it's a bit the same. I mean, we gradually discovered all the implications of having this currency. There are also political lessons. I said a currency without a state. At the origin of the euro, there was a debate on when and under what conditions to create a common currency. Some said there needs to be a very long process of convergence of countries, and then at the end you can imagine a currency. Some said, let's create a currency and it will by itself provoke some sort of unification. The German central banker, Hans Tietmeyer, liked in this debate to quote a philosopher, a French medieval philosopher, who was saying, money does not belong to the prince, it belongs to the community. And in fact, it was emphasizing the link between a currency and the sense of a community that underpins the fact that you share a currency with others. So there are political lessons there. And there are also lessons in terms of governance, in terms of what kind of executive, what kind of capacity of decision, what kind of capacity of implementation you need if you create a currency. So that's the story, and I can tell the story of this crisis in two different ways. Actually, one will be to tell you about the chain of events and how this chain of events developed, and how mistakes were made, and how mistake and the addition of mistakes transformed a small event into a major crisis. And the issue there is to try to understand why those mistakes were made. Because after all, Greece represented 2% of the GDP of the euro area. And so, a problem with the debt of a country that represents 2% of total GDP, in principle, it's a problem that's relatively easy to solve. Now, I can tell the same story as saying, in fact, this chain of events, this unfolding of the crisis, this is in fact the result of flaws, deficiencies in the design of the monetary union. And in fact, they happen in this way, they could have happened in another way, but whatever the particular scenario, there were flaws in the design of this currency without a state, the currency union without a state, and those flaws would have, one way or another, they would have become evident at some point. And I think there is truth in both, because I think we did mismanage this crisis in a way that is extraordinary. And certainly, having avoided a number of mistakes would have let the euro area continue to benefit from this extraordinary credibility it had at the start, and that was completely squandered in the crisis. But it's true also that underneath there were problems, and that these problems, they could have been delayed, they could have perhaps been addressed, but they couldn't have just been left unattended. So, that's the way of introduction. Now, I will start with a bit of history. I will go on with some analysis of the crisis, some story of the crisis, and then discuss the deeper issues before going to the policy response and the outlook. Now, the crisis, I'd like to start with a quote from the governor of the Bank of England. It was in the quiet times, Mervyn King, and he said, "Our ambition at the Bank of England is to be boring. We don't want to make the news. We want the currency to be ignored. We want monetary policy to be something you don't have to talk about. Extremely boring." And central bankers can be pretty good at being boring. In fact, if you listen to some speeches of central bankers. And it was in a way saying, the currency is there to be ignored. It's just something normal. If there is no inflation, if there are no disruptions, no financial disruptions, you just use the currency as you use the metric system. You don't bother asking questions unless you're a specialist, and you just consider it's a natural way of doing things. Now the euro stopped being boring sometime in 2009, and it stopped being boring exactly on the 16th of October of 2009, when the Greek Prime Minister suddenly announced that, in fact, the numbers as regards the budget and the level of debt that had been communicated to the European partners were wrong. And that, in fact, for 2009, but also for the years before, deficit had been much higher, and that for this reason, the accumulated debt was much higher. And that, you could say there were early indications before, but that certainly triggered nervousness in the financial market that started pricing the Greek debt differently and starting to wonder whether Greece would be able to repay its debt. That's the story you probably have heard at the time or seen later in the news. why Greece? Because Greece was a country that we discovered as the crisis developed was deeply dysfunctional economically and politically. This was a country with a very weak state, a very weak public administration, lots of rent-seeking, an economy that had developed on the basis of public borrowing, a political tradition of spending and recruiting people, recruiting supporters in public administration at the time of election. So all the things you wouldn't wish to see in a currency union that is well managed. But this is what we saw, and that we had been guilty of ignoring because we didn't look very carefully. And nobody wanted to look very carefully. And indeed, when the Prime Minister announced that and then called the IMF, suddenly you had to discover all that. But then when Greece said, we may have problem accessing to the market, we may have problem borrowing, we're going to need assistance, suddenly it exposed that there was nothing in place to provide assistance to a partner country. That the euro area was built on the assumption that the prevention system was good enough to avoid crisis. That by scrutinizing the public finances of the participating countries, you would make sure that they would behave in a way that would prevent crisis. And there was no crisis management system in place. It's a bit like having very good sprinklers in the ceiling, and so wherever there is a beginning of a fire, the sprinkler starts sprinkling, and so the fire is extinguished, and you don't need a fire brigade. We didn't have a fire brigade, and we didn't know even what would be the principles, whether to provide assistance, who had to provide assistance. George Papandreou called the IMF and said, we're in trouble, we need your support. And the IMF said, yes, but call your fellow Europeans and ask them what they want to do. Because you're a member of the IMF, Greece, you're a country, but at the same time, you're part of a currency union. So we need to know what your partner think, whether they want the IMF to participate in giving support or not. And the participants, the member of the currency union, they didn't know. They had different views. Some said, no, we're a currency union, we don't need the IMF, we can do it by our own. Some said, we need the IMF because the IMF is equipped with the capacity to assist, and we don't have a capacity to assist, and actually assisting would be giving the signal that we are soft, so that would give the wrong signal to other potential countries in the same situation. So we don't want to provide assistance. Perhaps the best is for Greece to default. And this discussion went on from October until May, October 2009 until May 2010. And so, October to May, it's 7 months. 7 months during which, months after months, markets starting asking questions more and more precise, and they were told, no, don't worry, we're going to find a solution, but they weren't told which solution. And so the credibility was, in the process, squandered. Now, it's unfortunate that Greece was the country in trouble, because about at the same time, Ireland also had problems. Ireland was a very different economy. Ireland was a very, modern economy, an economy known for being the home of multinational companies, for having gained a lot in terms of productivity. It was a country whose GDP per capita had gone from being very low to being above average, significantly above average. But Ireland had let a real estate bubble a housing bubble develop, as many countries have done. You know, it's like the US subprime crisis, or like the housing bubble we saw in Japan. You know, it's very common. But Ireland had let a real estate bubble develop in extraordinary proportions. And suddenly, when the global crisis hit in 2007, 2008, then they discovered that, you know, income went down, risk appetite went down, and therefore you had, at the time you discovered that there were many of those credits given to households that would not be repaid because those households were in negative equity and that the banks had made losses. So nothing to do with public sector management. It was a very low debt economy, 25% debt to GDP ratio, had no deficit, very well managed, except for this housing boom that they had let develop in this way. The fact that Greece was the first meant that for many people in Europe, it was interpreted as meaning it is a fiscal problem. It is a problem of budgetary mismanagement that has caused all that. Had it been Ireland, simply this didn't match the fact. In the case of Ireland, it was a private credit development. So Ireland followed shortly before, after Greece, and showed that you know, private credit was in fact, the history of private credit was in fact at least as much a contributor to this crisis and public misbehavior. And in fact, if you take into account Spain, which is a far bigger economy, Spain was very much the same story as the story of Ireland. A private credit boom, you know, a kind of housing bubble frenzy, and a very conservative fiscal policy. So it was not fiscal policy. But somehow the debate was seen as being driven by mostly the fiscal misbehavior. Now, after this first step in which the question about assisting or not was debated until there was an agreement to share support between the IMF and the euro area partners. A second question quickly arose, which was, is Greece going to be able to repay its debt? And this was a question for Greece, potentially also for other countries. Ireland, I said, started with a very low debt to GDP ratio, 25% to GDP. But since it was in such a good fiscal shape, the Irish government thought they could just promise to guarantee all the debt of the banking sector, which was a major mistake because this debt of the banking sector, it ended up costing 40% of GDP. So they added 40% of private debt. They transferred those 40% of GDP of private debt into the public debt. And added to the cost of the recession, this made the debt ratio of Ireland dangerously high. So it was potentially a problem for other countries. But for Greece, it soon emerged that the combination of accumulated debt, the deficit that, you know, in 2009 was 15% of GDP, finally, 15. The deficit that continued to exist in 2010 and beyond, because you don't reduce the deficit just by the stroke of a pen, all that made the debt unsustainable. And there were two possible attitudes. One was to say, we have to preserve absolutely the quality, the reputation of the sovereigns. It's a common good. We in Europe repay our debts. Therefore, nobody, no state should be allowed to default. And let's lend to Greece at zero interest rate for whatever time it takes, but let's make sure that Greece is going to repay its debt. That was one attitude. The other attitude was to say, no, Greece is insolvent, but let's immediately, as soon as it is evident that it is insolvent, let's restructure the Greek debt, and let's make sure that Greece is seen by everyone as a special case. So there is no contagion of the Greek restructuring to other countries, because it's immediately separated. You ring fence Greece, then you say Greece is special, Greece is mismanaged, other countries are well managed, so let's restructure immediately the Greek debt. And both, where you can have one view or the other, but both were rational, coherent views. The problem is that the political compromise between the two was to say, we lend to Greece, but at high interest rates, which meant that Greece was made insolvent by the fact that you were lending to it at too high interest rates. You can always make a country solvent if you lend it at zero interest rate. But if you ask it to pay a penalty interest rate because you want to indicate that it's bad to go into debt, then you're going mechanically to make this country insolvent. And this is what we did. So the political compromise between actually France, which was very much of the first view, and Germany, which was more of the second view, created an inconsistent response. And that was one of the mismanagement. After this long hesitation about assisting or not assisting, there was a second mismanagement about deciding to restructure or not restructure the Greek debt. It was an important debate. I mean, it's an important choice. Remember the Lehman shock. Remember the failure of Lehman Brothers. The reason was given on the spot was moral hazard. Let's make an example. Let's show to those bankers let's show to the creditors that they're not going to be repaid whatever they do. That there's not going to be a generalized bailout of the imprudent lenders. In the event, it proved to be, an adventurous decision not to bail out Lehman Brothers, because it triggered a generalized panic and the crisis of 2008 and 2009. It was a bit the same. You could have decided Greece is small enough, we can ring fence, we can limit the consequence of Greece. Greece is not systemic, one view. The other was that, it's opened the Pandora box of that restructuring. So it was a real debate. But simply, you have to give a consistent answer to a question, to give an answer that is a political compromise and that is not a real answer, is not a way to manage those things. So that's my story about the mismanagement of the crisis, and I could go on and we may go back to some of the aspects in the discussion. Now, what about the more fundamental aspects? The more fundamental aspects were that if you take a broad view, if you look back, you're going to observe today that a major divergence has been created between the north and the south of the euro area. You have a competitive north and an uncompetitive south, and in between, countries that are in between. And the only exception to geography is that I'm putting Ireland in the south, but otherwise it's pretty geographic. So Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece have grown uncompetitive, and France to not the same extent, but to some extent have grown uncompetitive vis-à-vis Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Austria, countries that have gained competitiveness. And we have seen this asymmetry develop. The question is why? And evidently, having in a currency union two parts, one with much higher inflation than the other one, and so the real exchange rate, as we say, that diverge, and that's that's a dangerous development for a monetary union. That's precisely what we knew from the start, from all the research we had on the economics of monetary union. What we knew was potentially a major problem. Asymmetries, different fates, the same monetary policy that is inappropriate for the competitive half and inappropriate for the uncompetitive half because it's just in the middle. So the question is why? And here there are two explanations that are not in contradiction with each other, but both are important. One is simply initial conditions. The initial conditions were that at the time the euro was created, Germany was coming from the German unification. It had, vis-à-vis the countries in the fixed exchange rate regime, vis-à-vis the Deutschmark, it had grown uncompetitive, so Germany was struggling. Germany was in an external deficit in '98. The rest of the Southern European countries, they joined lately. They were coming from very high interest rate that when they joined the monetary union, converged brutally, suddenly, to the German level. So you had high interest rate going down like that. And so you had countries in the north, Germany and others, but mostly Germany, that were struggling because they were starting from an uncompetitive position and started making enormous effort to reduce costs, to rebuild the industrial base, to outsource, etc., in order to regain competitiveness. I mean, there was a famous book in Germany in 2003, 2004, don't remember exactly, whose title was, "Is Germany Still to Save?" by a famous economist. Can we still save the German economy? Because it was perceived as being so uncompetitive. And in the south, you had the interest rate going down like a stone, and therefore it became extremely tempting to borrow, because you had your interest rate that had gone from 7% to 3%. And so the temptation to borrow was there. People started borrowing. The more they started to borrow, the more the demand developed. The more, therefore, there was demand pressure. Inflation started developing. The more inflation developed, the more the real interest rate, after having deflated by inflation, declined. And therefore, there was a vicious circle there, with the south getting into a demand boom and the north being in a restructuring and effort drive to reduce inflation and to become competitive. And that developed for 10 years, divergence. Now, we knew exactly that this could happen. And that was very well documented in the research on the costs and benefits of monetary union. The thing is that there was a belief that the private economy was stable and that instability would be caused by fiscal irresponsibility. And therefore, not much was done to limit that. What could have been done? For example, Spain should have had higher taxes on mortgages. Limit the tax deductibility of interest rate on mortgages. They could have reduced the potential length of credit, the duration of mortgages. They could have introduced loan-to-value ratios, etc. I mean, all sorts of instruments that you can use to limit a credit boom and a housing boom. But that was politically extremely difficult. So the courage there was not there in Spain. And, the technocrats were saying, we've got to do something. The politicians were telling them, no, everybody wants to benefit from this housing boom. And behind every boom of this sort, there is a story. The book by Ken Rogoff, This Time is Different. So this time is different. The Spanish version of This Time was different was Spain has become an immigration country. Spain, there are many people who want to come to Spain. And also Spain is so nice that all the pensioners from Northern Europe, they want to come to Spain to spend their last years under the Spanish sun. So we've got to build for all that. So there was a story. So you could believe in this story or you could pretend to believe in this story. And this is what happened. And the European system was much too much confident that in fact, private behavior were not leading to instability, that only public mismanagement would be leading to instability, so nothing was done at European level either. So that was very much something that was anticipated, could have been prevented, and nothing was done. So it was a mistake, a failure of economic management of the euro area. Is it the whole of what we have seen? Not really. What we have seen, what we have learned in this crisis, is also that things could happen that nobody had really seen. And that made this crisis much more severe than it would have been in the absence of those phenomena. And I'm referring here to the fact that this Spanish boom, this Southern European boom, it was largely fueled by private capital inflows. So capital flew in from Northern Europe to Southern Europe and from the rest of the world. There were massive capital inflows that facilitated external deficits and facilitated credit. I mean, it went largely through the interbank market. Banks were able to borrow very easily, so bank could borrow and lend. That developed until 2008, 10, and massively 11. And then in 2010, 2011, capital started to flow out. And in the same way we had massive inflows of capital, we have massive outflows of capital. And suddenly you had a real balance of payment crisis inside the monetary union. Now, that's something very, very few people, and when I say very, very few, it's really very few. It's probably one, perhaps, one I have identified, perhaps a little bit more, but really very few, that nobody had really anticipated, that you could have a balance of payment crisis inside the monetary union. Normally, you know what is a balance of payment crisis. You had a balance of payment crisis in this country. It's associated with the existence of the currency. So you say, people start to shy away from a currency. Say, I don't want to have investment in rubles. I want to short the ruble. And that provokes the balance of payment crisis. Now here, it's euros. They're all euros. So what happened is that people suddenly said, I don't want anything Spanish. It can be the Spanish state, it can be the Spanish companies, it can be the Spanish banks. I don't want anything Spanish. And that's very surprising, because in a country, you never see that. Within a country, you never see, people within a country, financial market within a country saying, I don't want, exposure to St. Petersburg. It would seem completely absurd. And it is absurd, and it does not happen. The reason why it happens in the euro area, and why it happened in the euro area, is that the banking system remained largely national. So the Spanish borrowers, they borrowed from Spanish banks. So if the borrowers, the households, become insolvent, this affects the banks. And what happened if it affects the banks? It affects the state, because the state guarantees the banks. The state has a responsibility for bailing out the banks if the banks are insolvent. And the state at the same time, if the households are insolvent, loses tax receipts potentially from households, because the households are not able to pay the the taxes anymore. And therefore, it contaminates all the agents within a country because of this connection between private borrowers, banks, and the state. And this creates a fragility that we have seen developing in recent quarters, basically since summer 2011, so for a bit more than 1 year. We have seen the financial fragmentation of the euro area. And this financial fragmentation means that the lending conditions become completely different depending on where you're located. There is a nice story about a bank called UniCredit. It's an Italian-German bank. And this bank has customers, an Austrian bank. And this bank has customers, hotels, that are located exactly on the two sides of the border, exactly in the same region. And the hotel, they have exactly the same business because they are tourists. Tourists, they go to Italy or they go to Austria, and there's the same mountains, and they go there, and they are the same hotels. But they lend to those hotels at the same bank. But they lend to the hotels on very different terms because those hotels, they're located on two sides of the border. So it affects agents that normally should be borrowing more or less on the same rates, and that because of this fragmentation don't borrow on the same rates anymore. So that has indicated that there was something much deeper in this difficulty, in this crisis of the euro area, than just the issue of public debt, it's just the issue of mismanagement, that there was a fragility there, that there was a flaw in the design. Because the design, nobody had assumed that something of this sort could happen. And that's what prompted the decision to go for something called the banking union, so to transfer the responsibility for bank supervision and implicitly, at least, bank rescue and restructuring to the European level. So essentially to say, we have built a monetary union based on an existing financial union or a half-backed financial union, so we have to create the financial union and move this responsibility to the European level. Now, what does it mean to have responsibility at European level for banks? It means a lot, because it means that there are fiscal risks. As I said, the Irish crisis had a cost amounting to 40% of Irish GDP. And there are other examples of very costly banking crises. Banking crisis can often be very costly. Second, if you if you have to manage a banking crisis, very often you have to close down banks, to force mergers, to force absorption. So it's really a hands-on decision. And you know how difficult it is, how politicized it can be to deal with, to impose losses. To say, this bank is insolvent, now the losses have to be shared. Part of them have to be borne by the shareholders, part of them have to be borne by the creditors, part of them have to be borne by the taxpayers, and we're going to distribute the losses. That's what the management of a banking crisis means. So this means a very strong authority and a political responsibility at European level. So that's the discussion of today. Really, the decision of principle was taken. Now we have to implement it, and it's hard to implement it. It needs to have a consistency that was not always demonstrated in the previous stages of the crisis. And that's very much the step that is being discussed today. Now, to conclude, what's next? Is it sufficient? I mean, can we say, if we do the banking union, the problem are going to be solved, crisis will abate, and we're going to restore stability? Well, the divide between the North and the South remains. I mean, it is there. Jobs have moved to the North. The jobs in the South, that all the workers that were in the real estate sector they're unemployed. This largely, much too large non-traded goods sector has to shrink. And this means considerable suffering, we know, with unemployment rates that are above 20-25%, unemployment rate among young people that are extremely high, close to 50%, and economies that are still struggling, that are still shrinking. So this is a major adjustment that needs to take place. And I think the question there is really, and that's a question that is not yet in the debate, is the solution to this problem going to be that people move to jobs, or that jobs move to people? I mean, you would wish jobs to move to people, but in fact, we have seen a concentration of manufacturing industries in the north of Europe. You have seen probably agglomeration effect taking place. You know that it's become efficient to produce in the north. And what is going to take to reverse that is a question I don't think we have a very good answer to. And perhaps what's going to happen is that there will be more labor mobility, that young people from the south are going to migrate to the north, and that we are going to see emerging a degree of integration that is not due to a choice, but that's due to a lack of alternative, that will mean that people are going to move. And if people move, it's going to have a number of implications. You can think of, if people move, what are the implications for the pension systems? What are the implications for the social security, the unemployment benefit systems? What are the implications for the fiscal systems, the tax systems, etc.? There are a number of things that go with the mobility of people that this far had not been that big. So that's part of the discussion that we're having. And you see, as I've told you this story and given to you some of my analysis of the way I see it, how far this unfolding of consequences goes. So perhaps at this stage you're asking yourself, why is it that he's not advocating a breakup? Wouldn't it be simpler to come back to national currencies? Perhaps it would have been simpler not to have a monetary union at all. And we can come back in the discussion of why in the first place was this monetary union created. But at this stage, the euro has had, as a major consequence, the fact that there has been a lot of financial interdependence that has been created. So that more and more, I describe those capital flows, and those capital flows meaning that there was cross-border exposure, that savers are exposed to the fate of the countries in which their saving has been invested. There has been considerable success in financial integration. Now, at the same time, I said financial integration is being unmade. We've seen a financial disintegration. But the financial disintegration doesn't mean that there are no financial exposure. It simply means that the public exposure through the banking system, through the financial assistance, has replaced the exposure through private capital flows. So it's still there, but it's simply the risk has shifted from private holders to public holders. It's probably the indication that I have to stop. And so the financial integration is there. And if you break up, you basically have, imagine you are a company, you are pension funds, and you have a balance sheet, and it's balanced. You have assets and liabilities, they're all in euros. Now suddenly you're told what is here on this side of the balance sheet in euros is converted into new drachmas or whatever the name of the currency, and the other side that remains in euros. Basically, you're either very rich or very poor or bankrupt. Because there was no currency risk. And the financial integration that was driven by the fact that there was no currency risk anymore. Now, if you recreate the currency risk at random, depending on, whether you have invested here or there, under the assumption that there was no currency risk, you're making agents who've done that bankrupt. So you're creating enormous wealth transfers. And I think what binds us together is really beyond the politics, beyond the feeling in several countries that, we enter into that, we've got to solve the problem together. It's this degree of financial integration that is there. And in my country, I'm French, people have been asked recently, was it a good idea, in an opinion poll, was it a good idea to create this currency? And 65% said no. We shouldn't have gone into the euro. And then they were asked, should we leave? And 65% said no. So exactly the same proportion. So people are actually, they say, they have doubts now. They're less supportive of the euro than they were before. They see on TV the crisis every day. They see the demonstration in Greece, etc. But at the same time, they say, okay, we've got to solve this problem, and to undo the euro, to break up, would not be a good solution. So that's the situation we're in. And let me conclude just by saying, it's a lesson of history that you enter something of this sort, you create a commitment, there are a number of consequences, and you're led to do things in order to, it's what we call past dependency. So you can't just go back to the previous stage. You're into something, you have to find solutions to it, and this implies consequences that people at the start would not have imagined, or they wouldn't have perhaps supported. So we don't know yet what kind of European economy is going to emerge from this crisis. Certainly there will be a lot of suffering along the road for some people. Certainly there are inevitably a lot of political opposition, of disputes. But perhaps that's a way to build a more integrated European economy, and perhaps it's a way to build a stronger economy for the future. We don't know yet. Let me stop here. So, as I said, I'm very keen on debating with you, and so I've left consciously quite some time for the debate.
Теперь время для вопросов.
Как всегда, можно поднимать руки, и мы будем приносить вам микрофон.
Sorry, perhaps I should choose.
Вот мне кажется, вот есть три...
Wait a minute. Yes? Okay.
Сейчас слышно, да?
Хорошо. Which channel is it?
Можно, да? Ой, не слышно.
Okay, sure.
Вот мне кажется, есть несколько причин, которые вы не осветили. Я хотел бы просто знать ваше мнение. Причина этого кризиса, на мой взгляд. Первая причина этого общего кризиса европейского, мне кажется, заключается в следующем. Вот Путин, президент России, сказал, что Америка паразитирует на мировой экономике, производя 20% мирового ВВП, потребляет 40%. Вот эта разница, это и есть те ресурсы, которые выкачиваются в том числе из Европы. Первое. Второе. Вот мне кажется, вывод промышленности активный в Азию, в общем, в погоне за прибылью, обескровил многие экономики Европы. И неразумнее ли было сделать, чтобы именно, пусть субсидируя, но оставить промышленность в Европе и в тех странах, которые испытывали сложности. И третье.
Третий?
Вот в обороте находится такое количество валюты, которое не соответствует материальному содержанию. Это тоже искусственная система. Вот как вы считаете, эти проблемы являются причиной кризиса и как их решить можно? Спасибо.
Okay. Thank you for putting into the discussion the global dimension, because I gave you a story. I mentioned Lehman in passing, but basically this was a purely euro area story that I gave you, and you're telling me, what about what's going on in the rest of the world? And I think you're right. You're right because, especially of your second point. The second point was the implication of Asia and globalization. The southern part of Europe was weakened definitely by globalization, whereas Germany was a country that succeeded in benefiting from globalization. Portugal, in the past, it was a low-cost producer of the EU. It produced, shoes and clothing at low cost. But with China coming in, Portugal basically lost this market. And at the same time, Germany the German industry reinvented itself by outsourcing a large part of the low-cost segment in Central and Eastern Europe, and therefore concentrated the value-added segments in Germany. So the model of Germany for restore competitiveness was to cut costs at home, but it was also to really break the value chain and outsource all the low-cost segments and keep the high value-added segments in Germany. So in a way, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, without these shocks, Portugal would be better off and Germany would be worse off. So the globalization was part, definitely, of the story. This was an asymmetric shock, as the economists would say. No, an asymmetric shock that was positive for Germany in the end and negative for Portugal, and also for Spain or for Greece. But I take the example of Portugal because it's the country that was affected the most. So here I agree entirely. I mean, it's not an entirely European story. It's there was a constellation of forces that went in the wrong direction. The initial conditions, the weaker structure of the Southern European economies, the effect of globalization, all that contributed to creating this asymmetry that I have mentioned. Now, on what you said on the US, I would agree less. I think Europe had roughly kind of balanced external account. The counterpart to the US deficits, that was largely China's and Japan's and the Middle Eastern surpluses. That was not so much Europe. Now, the way Europe interacted with the US was much more in terms of financial investment. So there was a lot of financial investment, European financial investment in the US, and a lot of financial US investments in Europe. And now the Europeans were stupid enough to invest considerably in the subprime market and the financial product derived from the subprime market. So they made losses. And those losses, they explain why Europe got the cold after the US subprime crisis developed. remember that it was in Europe first that you had to close some funds, and that the central bank was forced to provide liquidity to the banking sector because of the degree of integration between Europe and the US. And the Europeans made many losses on their US investment. Now, on your final point about the currencies, modern currencies are not based on commodities. I mean, modern currencies, they're based on the quality of the management of the currency, the quality of the institution, the institutional setup, the mandate of the central bank, the ability of the central bank to manage the currency, not so much on commodities. And that's very much what has created this situation of relatively benign inflation, relative price stability, what we call the great moderation that developed in the last decade of the 20th century, the first decade of the 21st century, that was very much this institutional investment. And I don't think we should return to commodities-based currencies. Yeah. Oh, you've put it back. Okay. Sorry.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за лекцию. У меня такой вопрос. Вот по моим собственным наблюдениям, сейчас все усугубляется. Ситуация, она не выравнивается, а все хуже. То есть виткообразно куда-то уходит, ведет нас вниз. Нас, я имею в виду, как глобальное сообщество. Если посмотреть статистику по безработице, там, по-моему, около 11% трудоспособного населения в Европе в целом безработные. И, например, по Греции это 25%, это четверть. То есть, по сути, четверть населения страны, то есть экономика не нуждается в четверти населения. Конечно, прогноз неблагодарное дело, но где, по-вашему, окончание этого сумасшествия и когда уже все начнет выравниваться? Ведь еще, по сути, не задействованы такие глобальные рынки, как Азия, как Россия. То есть, по сути, это сейчас еще на нас отразится, наверное, следующим витком. И потом уже как-то начнет оно суммарно в среднем выравниваться. Где, в какой год, может быть, какой век, я не знаю. Может быть, через поколение, может быть, через 2. Вы видите вообще окончание этого всего сумасшествия? Спасибо.
You're asking for a forecast. First of all, I agree. I mean, I agree that this is a terrible situation. That to see, that many people unemployed and the economy shrinking. The Greek economy is still shrinking. The Spanish economy is in a recession. The whole of the euro area is in a recession. And Southern Europe in a deeper recession. I mean, there is nothing to be pleased about, and I think the faster we can get out of it, the better. Now, why is it that it's happening? Part of it is inevitable. When you have grown your demand that much, with respect to your supply side, you're bound to restore a degree of balance. If you take Spain had a 10% external deficit. So it was producing 100 and consuming 110, and that's. And the situation inside was that the sector that does not export, the sector that is really the domestic sector, had grown much too large. The construction sector was 3 times larger than it should have been. At some point in Spain, they were building more houses than in the US, with a population of 40 million people. So when this ends, the people in the construction sector, they lose their job. There is nothing you can do about it. They have to lose their job. They have to find a job in another sector. And the other sector you want to grow is the sector that exports, because that you want to close the external gap. And the sector, it can only, grow as long as there are investments, as long as there is external demand, as long as it is competitive, it's able to produce things that people want to buy. So this process is inevitably painful. It's inevitably, people, you don't take a construction worker and transform him or her into a kind of manufacturing worker instantaneously. I mean, it has to go through this kind of painful, terribly painful adjustment. That's the price of the past mistakes. Now, are we going beyond? Are we making the pain worse than it should be? In part, yes. In part, yes. I think that, Greece, the Greek economy, is now something like 20% smaller than what it was before the crisis. I mean, that's too much. The responsibility is in part with the Greek themselves. They have put not enough effort into reforming their own economy. And for example, the oldest sector of trade, services, remains full of rents. So in fact, wages have gone down. Wages have gone down. People say wages are rigid. It's not true. Wages in Greece, they've gone down 15%. But prices, they still remain high. So there's a lot of rents in those sectors. And people don't want competition. They don't want to lower their prices. And so that creates too much suffering for wage earners. That means that since prices are not declining, the competitiveness is not regained. And therefore, it makes the suffering longer, harder than it should be. Now, are the Greeks the only one responsible? No. I think the program of assistance, they were biased towards the fiscal adjustment. They didn't put enough emphasis on this part of the growth enhancing reforms. Too much emphasis was put on the fiscal side. And also, the Europeans, they have instruments they could be using to support the resumption of growth in the Greek economy. They should do more for that than what they're doing at present. So I think I agree with you that there is no sufficient urgency, priority put on the resumption of growth. Having said that, inevitably part of the adjustment goes through this painful process.
I wanted to ask a question about a word you didn't mention in your speech, and that's democracy. The EU has often been accused of having a democracy deficit, but the euro crisis seems to have brought this issue to a fore. Today in the Financial Times, just to give one example, there was an article about European leaders trying to find a new way to give money to Greece, but trying to structure it so that it wouldn't have to go through a vote in Germany's parliament. So I wanted to ask whether Europe's leaders were wrong in seeing the current crisis as simply an economic or a structural institutional problem, rather than trying to address the roots of a democratic deficit in Europe.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the fact that it seems to me that Germany's leaders are doing something, bailing out Southern Europe, which its voters don't really approve of. And the same thing is true in Finland, where you've had Eurosceptic parties.
No, but the democratic deficit, it's in a way to say that there is not a way to aggregate the votes of the people in various countries, right? We have built a system of mutual assistance. This means I'm lending you my money. So it's not a federal system that we've built in this respect. It's a system of I'm lending you my money for you to, as a way of assisting you. But obviously, the national parliament is accountable of this money to the national taxpayers. And so if you go in Northern Europe, people are afraid of losing their money. It's basically what they are afraid of. I mean, they are afraid of having lent, and that at some point they will be told, this money you lent, does not exist anymore. It was burnt. And that's what you see in the reaction to the crisis in countries like Finland, in countries like Germany, this fear. Now, the people in Southern Europe, they have lost their job. So for them, the key question is the jobs. I mean, is the economic situation. And if you take a country like Ireland, essentially the question in Ireland is that they consider that they have been forced to actually bail out their own, the creditors of their banks. So they have been forced to transfer taxpayers' money into the creditors of the bank. And that's what matters for them. So the question, democratic deficit, would you aggregate all these people? If you aggregate all these people, you would have a majority. But what would this majority mean? I mean, whatever the decision that would be taken, they would be in different situations. Now, you could say, instead of creating a system of mutual insurance, we should have created a federal system with a common budget, with taxing for for financing of assistance, and therefore having a representation at European level. But that would be a giant step in the creation of a federation. So in a way, that would be a response. That would be a response in which there would be democratic accountability, but that would assume that you can aggregate and that people would accept that if they're outvoted because they're in a minority and the people in the neighboring countries, they have a different view, but they are more numerous, that they accept the legitimacy of it. I tend to be in favor, but at the same time I recognize that there are limits to what you can do by just institutional design. And that the willingness of people to accept that you aggregate their votes, every day we see limitations to that. We see, the Belgian elections, we see the Spanish Catalonia saying we don't want to pay for the other states, the other regions anymore. We see that in Italy. We see that in many places actually in the world where you see that people at some point they say, no, this aggregation that you're telling us is just a normal way of counting opinion. It doesn't work for us because what counts for us is a smaller unit we feel we're part of. Sorry.
Добрый вечер. Спасибо за вашу лекцию. Спасибо за вашу лекцию. Скажите, пожалуйста, кризис еврозоны связан с самим фактом введения евро, с тем, что разные экономики были объединены в валютном союзе, с тем, что не были созданы все необходимые механизмы регулирования? Либо кризис еврозоны все-таки связан с проблемами мировой экономики, с глобализацией и, в общем-то, с внешними причинами?
Well, I said that external causes had an importance, but I wouldn't attribute the crisis to external causes. Maybe we were, just unlucky to have seen this shock that global financial crisis that happens once in 50 years or once in a century, and that it happened just at this time. This is a coincidence of events. We had these European developments, and they were in part unhealthy, but obviously they would have been much easier to address in a global environment that would have been different. Now, we had this major financial crisis. We know that those crises, major financial crises, they mean output loss that are major. They mean, debt, an accumulation of public debt. So that's worldwide. If you look at all advanced countries, the US, you look at Japan, you look at the Euro area, you look at the UK, you see that the they're all struggling. All have had an increase in public debt that is enormous. All have seen their output that is, roughly at the level of 2007 or below. And in this kind of environment, you have to manage a euro crisis. So that's bad luck. But perhaps, had this global crisis happened 10 years from now, after the euro had managed its own asymmetries, it would be very different. Sure, but it's now that it happens. So we have actually to look at what we can deal with. And these asymmetries, this weakness of adjustment mechanisms, that are our own responsibility. So that's what we can address. And those mechanisms, they are indeed too weak. They are indeed too weak. And I think that we have a responsibility for not having, or governments have a responsibility for not having acted. It was clear when we joined the euro that this was a weakness. I mean, all the research was saying weakness is that there are asymmetries and there are weak adjustment mechanisms. Government could have acted to strengthen those adjustment mechanisms. So that's the functioning of labor markets, the functioning of product markets, that's ways to prevent asymmetries from growing, from developing. They were told actually by the European Central Bank, the governor was saying all the time, there is too much divergence, there is too much divergence. So they were worried. People like us, we wrote paper back in 2005, 2006 saying there is too much divergence. So it was seen, but nothing was done. So there was a responsibility, and going forward, there is a responsibility to strengthen the adjustment mechanism. The problem was that the energy was put into gaining the qualification for the euro. And after that, government didn't want to go back to the citizen and said, you have accepted the fiscal contraction to go into the euro, fiscal adjustment, because we had to satisfy a certain deficit level. We had to have inflation below a certain threshold, so you had to accept that. Now there is more to come, and the more is a structural adjustment. They didn't say that. So they basically took it for granted, and they assumed that the euro would just be a benign environment. It was not a benign environment. I mean, it's an environment of discipline, because in a currency union, you don't have the possibility to adjust through devaluation anymore, so you need to find internal adjustment mechanisms, and that was missing. Now, the EU could also develop a mechanism of its own, and there is a discussion on that also. But a large part of the burden is on the side of the member states.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question. Could you please enumerate the possible consequences of the elimination of Greece, Spain, and other countries that are in deep crisis? I mean that today the leaders of the European Union have to direct all their efforts and resources on support of these countries, and they cannot concentrate on their own development and growth. Probably it is easier and better for the whole Eurozone just to exclude them.
That's a debate that has been going on for some time. The so-called Grexit. Should the Europeans tell the Greek governments, if you cannot adjust within the euro area, you've got to leave. The tendency, as you have seen, is that there is a reluctance to go all the way to telling the Greeks leave. And the reason is that there is a fear of the consequences in general. Well, first of all, for Greece, as economists, let's do a detour. As economists, we know that what Greece is trying to do is basically equivalent of changing instead of changing the clock when you move to the winter time, to make sure that everybody adjusts individually and wakes up an hour earlier without changing the clock. So basically you have to, zillions of individual decisions that have to be coordinated so that you can lower your price and regain competitiveness. And so it would seem to be easier from the Greek point of view that to say, okay, we leave, we have an exchange rate, and therefore we can regain competitiveness just by devaluing the exchange rate. Now, the difficulty there is, first of all, that Greece has no policy credibility whatsoever. The Greek government, the Greek central bank, no institution has credibility. So basically, nobody would wish then to invest in the Greek currency, so it would fall, the new currency would fall like a stone. And therefore, it would imply that the exchange rate would adjust probably much too much. So you would have to probably to assist Greece to avoid the situation in which the exchange rate would sink. It would sink if only because Greece has an external deficit still, an important one. I mean, it has shrunk a bit, but it's still important. So they need capital inflows. They need money to come in, and currently it's assistance money. But it would need to be again assistance money. So you would need to continue to assist Greece to exit, not in the same way, but as well as you have to help Greece to stay in. Second, what I said about this financial disruption that was created that would entirely apply to Greece. So a company that has debt vis-à-vis the suppliers. The suppliers, they are in country X or Y, and the suppliers, they would say this claim is in euros, and the Greek company would just not be able to repay the debt because its income would be in the new drachma at much lower level. So that would create all sort of financial disruption between the income and the debt. And third, it would force to define the how to leave. Now, so far, the Europeans have said the euro is irreversible, which is, an act of faith, because nothing is irreversible. And we know, there have been more than 60 monetary breakups in history since beginning of the 19th century. So in all these cases, it was supposed to be irreversible. But in the case of the euro area, it would mean, first of all, that would be probably the first time that you do it in a financially developed economy, in financially developed economies. Second, you would have to define exactly what the rules of the game for the breakup are. And therefore, everybody would know how to play the game for another country. So there would be a major effect on other countries. The question would immediately be, what about Portugal? And if you're telling people, if you have an account in a Greek bank, it's going to be forced conversion into new drachma. But if you have the same account in the branch of a German bank or a French bank in Greece, because it's a branch, it's under the German law or the French law, it's not going to be converted, it's going to remain in euros. Everybody will take the money out of the Portuguese bank and put them in branches of French bank or German banks or Spanish banks, or perhaps not Spanish banks, because they will know that at no cost they can protect themselves against the risk of redenomination. So basically, it would trigger a chain of event that nobody knows, how they would be, what the consequences would be. So the fear is that by trying to solve a small problem, you would create a bigger problem, and that's why there has been hesitation. Evidently, if you read Germany, there were hesitation. There were ministers even saying, why don't we tell the Greek to leave? But visibly they have changed position, and I think it's largely because they have tried to figure out what would be the consequences. They consider that the cost of this breakup would be larger than the benefits.
Спасибо большое за лекцию. Недавно прошедшая неделя Нобелевских лауреатов наталкивает на мысли, что в свое время надо было Нобелевские премии по литературе дать Толстому и Булгакову Михаилу. Потому что первый сказал, что все семьи счастливы одинаково, а несчастливы по-разному. А второй сказал, что москвичей испортил квартирный вопрос. Вот ситуация, связанная с кризисом последним, показывает, что жилищная проблема или ипотечный кризис в США, он породил один кризис, да, ипотечная проблема. А в Европе тоже мы видим, исходя из того, что вы говорите, определенная причина, корни кризиса лежат также в жилищной сфере. Может, понятно, большие деньги на большие сроки. В корпоративной Америке кризис все-таки, волну кризиса пустили ипотечные дома, корпорации. А в Европе вот эта волна идет все-таки от стран, поскольку это супранациональное образование. Другой Нобелевский лауреат по экономике, правда, в 2001 году Роберт Мандел разработал теорию оптимальных валютных зон. Можете ли вы сказать, что никак не вписывались Греция и ряд других, в первую очередь, южных стран в эту концепцию? В принципе, там просматривалась, то есть жестко усматривалась мобильность факторов и так далее. Пожалуйста, ваше мнение.
Okay, thank you. I knew that the first sentence of Anna Karenine applies perfectly to the European crisis, but I didn't know that Bulgakov had also something to say about it. On the role of the housing market, you're perfectly right. The housing market played a major role in these divergences, and you know, it's striking because it's a very usual crisis. It's a very standard crisis. This crisis of the housing market, the housing boom. I mean, we've seen that many times in history. We've seen many times this kind of frenzy, and always with terrible consequences. And nevertheless, we let it happen, and we believe. I mean, governments tend to believe that this time is different. That there are reasons to build houses. They're probably also, you know, under the influence of those who make gains, and it's terrible. I mean, it's terrible to see that in a country like Spain, you had people leaving university to go to to the real estate market and make money there, and now they find themselves without a job and without money and without a diploma because they just believe that they could make a fortune in the real estate market. That's terrible. So, true, but lessons from past crises are not sufficiently learned. Now we've put in place, a whole system at the central bank called macroprudential, systemic risk, etc., just to prevent all that. And probably for a generation, people are going to remember. The question is that the next generation may not remember. I mean, when the memory of past crisis goes away, when people with the memory of it leave and they're not part of the discussion and the decision anymore. Now, on Mandel, you're perfectly right. I mean, that was implicitly what I was saying, that we knew the euro area was not an optimum currency area. We knew that some countries were more fit to have a common currency. Some were not. Why did those countries participate? Because there were criteria, entry criteria set. These entry criteria, they were set in nominal terms. It's very hard to tell a country to participate, you need to have a labor market that works this way or that way, or an industrial specialization that is it or that. I mean, that's not something you can measure, you can set as a criterion. So what was said to government is that you've got to have a deficit that is below 3% and an inflation that is below X% and an interest rate that is below that percent. And they achieved that. And in 98, earlier, 96 or 97, Prime Minister of Italy went to see the Prime Minister of Spain. And he told him, why don't we delay? We're not ready. Perhaps we could join later. And the Prime Minister of Spain told the Prime Minister of Italy, do what you want, but I'm going to join. Because I'm Spain, and I would be more than happy to be ahead of you, Italy. That would be, after so many years in which Spain was seen as trailing Italy, I would be ahead of you, and that would be a matter of national pride. And so the Prime Minister of Italy said, I'm certainly not going to let Spain participate without having Italy in. I mean, having Italy out and Spain in would be a dishonor. And so there was a competition to join. And they both joined. But does it mean their economies were ready? No. It didn't mean that. And the problem is that after having joined, they stopped doing anything. They said, okay, we're in, that's it. So, national responsibility and a European responsibility that was to put so much emphasis on the fiscal side, on the fiscal discipline, without making country to observe, to abide by the fiscal rules, but ignoring all the private side.
И
Okay.
у нас подходит к концу дискуссии. Осталось время только для последнего вопроса. Вот он.
Здравствуйте. Несмотря на прилагаемые усилия, вам не кажется, что так как кризис в Европе является частью общемирового кризиса, который сейчас происходит, то он может все равно закончиться плохо, как бы там ни старались выправить ситуацию, спасая Грецию или Испанию, или не спасая ее? Как вы думаете, возможный вариант того, что еврозона просто развалится, и вместе с ней развалится сам Евросоюз, потому что сейчас очень многие уже говорят в Европе о провале европроекта в принципе. Как вам такой сценарий?
That's a concluding question, huh? It can collapse. I mean, I wouldn't say it's impossible. It can collapse. It can very well be that at a certain point, you have a decision to take, you come to a summit, you observe that you disagree, you have political constraints here, there, etc., and you just observe that you don't have anymore the energy, the willingness, the capacity to keep it together. Now, I criticize many of the things government did. Now, I have to recognize that each time they had to make a choice, they made the choice to keep it together. They made the choice of doing things, they said they have this sentence that, whatever it takes. And in fact, they have done it. They have done it too late. They have done it only when they are forced. Only the crisis, only the precipice leads them to put their act together and decide as soon as it goes a little bit better, you see the energy diminishing, you see the appetite for bold decisions diminishing. We've seen that last winter when the central bank provided liquidity in large quantities to the banks, interest rates went down, and suddenly everybody said, okay, we're safe, thank you, ECB. And this summer, the same happened with a new initiative by the ECB, and immediately you see everybody saying, okay, we're safe, thank you, ECB. And there was this decision that Spain should apply for a program that would open the way for some form of assistance, etc. They did nothing because they thought that the announcement by itself would be enough. Now, it's not enough, and they are likely to have to apply for a program. So it's true that the reluctance to move is there, and for good reasons. I mean, all those things are very difficult. But it's true also that when you're on the edge of a precipice, you tend to act. So that's the balance. And this far, I mean, if you look back and say what has been done in the course of 3 years, what has been done is to put in place a system of assistance that did not exist. What has been done is to, I did not develop on that, but strengthen considerably the system of surveillance of national policies and the fiscal rules. What is being done now is to consider banking union. All that is big, by the standards of international diplomacy. If you look back some years from now, you would say it's extraordinary what has been done in the course of 3 years, because much more has been done and much faster than any time before under the pressure of urgency. But it's only under the pressure of urgency. So my answer is I don't know. My bet would be that they're going to hang together, that they're going to, in the end, to find responses, perhaps in this awkward way, too late, half-backed responses, just what it needs, not more, something that keeps the market worried and that let states pay price for not being ahead of the curve, being always behind the curve, being late with respect to market expectations, but that they're going to do it anyway. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.